George Harrison smiled on camera, but behind his back, one individual made his life a nightmare. For years, this member of the Beatles dictated every note George played, ridiculed his spiritual practices, and used him like a servant. In 1969, George finally lost it and left the studio. But that wasn't the end of it. What this individual did during George's lowest times was transgress every rule of friendship. The betrayal was so deep that George carried the anger until his final breath. Today, we're revealing the shocking truth about the Beatle George Harrison truly hated more than anyone. George Harrison was born on February 25, 1943, in a tiny house at 12 Arnold Grove, Liverpool. The night he was born, the city was under its 78th straight night of bombing. His father, Harold, made only £3 a week as a bus conductor on 14-hour shifts and miles of walking to avoid using bus fare. George slept in a bed with his brothers until he was 16. His mother, Louise, did nights work cleaning offices and made only a couple of shillings a building. Their weekly food budget was only 15 shillings. But somehow or other, Louise had made their small house comfortable and hopeful. If this kind of story touches your heart, if you're someone who cares about truth, responsibility, and speaking up for the voiceless, please like this video, subscribe to our channel Star Vault TV, and share it with someone who should hear it. Let's get started. At the age of 12 in 1955, George was riding his bicycle by a house when he heard Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel being played from an open window. He braked, stiff and immobile, and listened to the full song. It changed everything. The sound of Elvis, particularly the echo on the guitar, ignited something in George. He ran home and informed his mother that he required a guitar more than he required food. Music took over his life from then on. George acquired his very first guitar when he was 14 years old. He went all the way to Frank Hess's music store and obtained a low-cost Eggman flat top for £3.10. It hurt to practice, and his fingers were bleeding for weeks, but he practiced 6 or 8 hours a day. He mastered Rock Island Line first, and then he did not care about school anymore. He failed nearly every subject other than art. His teacher even said that George was more interested in guitars than in geometry. In the same year, George met Paul McCartney. They were traveling on the number 86 bus to Liverpool when Paul spotted George's guitar. George informed him that he could play 20 Flight Rock, which was not an easy feat. Paul was impressed. Later, George auditioned with Paul's band, The Quarrymen. He played raunchy flawlessly, even though he was only 14 years and 364 days old. John Lennon did not want to add on someone so young, but George's ability couldn't be overlooked. He became the youngest of what would turn out to be the most renowned band of all time. The Harrison family all helped George in ways people wouldn't even imagine. Louise took a third job cleaning the Cavern Club to pay for his music equipment. Harold took George on the bus for free, despite risking losing his job for it. When George required a superior guitar, they pawned their piano. Louise pawned her wedding ring when the band played their first paid gig, so they could hire an amplifier. Every dollar was directed toward George's ambition. One of the pivotal moments occurred when Paul McCartney got stuck during a performance and couldn't play his solo. The group knew they needed a professional lead guitarist. Paul fought hard to get George, but Lennon wasn't convinced. George was only a young fellow. Paul eventually wore him down. They set up a second audition on a double-decker bus outside Wilson Hall. George played raunchy again, and Lennon reluctantly agreed. Subsequent research revealed that George had actually signed up by December 7, 1957, even before most believed. Lennon always handled George like a little brother, never as an equal. The 3-year age difference was a big issue during those times. George's suggestions were also always overlooked, and he always felt that he was not being taken seriously. With time, the tension only increased. George blew up during the Let It Be sessions in 1969. He informed Lennon that he wasn't content and split with the band for a period. Lennon even discussed replacing him with Eric Clapton. George said later that he was pushed aside particularly after Yoko Ono arrived in Lennon's life. When George joined the Quarrymen, the group was already on the verge of collapse. All the original members quit shortly thereafter. They continued to rename themselves. Johnny and the Moondogs, J-Page 3, Long John, and the Silver Beatles before settling on the Beatles in 1960. George's arrival signaled a change in sound as well. They moved from skiffle to actual rock and roll. He and Paul added pickups to their guitars and purchased an Elpico amp, providing the band with their first electric edge. George's musical abilities contributed to the development of the early Beatles sound. Next was Hamburg, a ruthless survival test. They were booked in 1960 at the Kaiserkeller. They performed 8 hours daily, drawing out songs to the maximum duration just to get through the time. The owner insisted they play like crazed animals. George was only 17. Their accommodation was at the rear of the stage, dirty and shared with other groups. They slept little. The bouncer at the club was an ex-boxer who had already murdered a guy during a street fight. It was tough, but it professionalized them. George was playing in the Star Club in 1962, performing nightly to massive audiences, discovering what survival meant in music. On February 9, 1964, something historic was broadcast on American television. 73 million viewed the Beatles on The Ed Sullivan Show. That was more than 60% of all TVs turned on in the nation that evening. CBS had a record 50,000 ticket requests, even with only 728 seats available in the studio. In 1957, when Elvis Presley first appeared, it garnered only 7,000 requests. Ed Sullivan set a rating high of 45.3 and a share high of 60 for the evening that night. Even Richard Nixon's daughters, Julie and Tricia Nixon, were in attendance. 5 songs were performed by the Beatles: All My Loving, Till There Was You, She Loves You, I Saw Her Standing There, and I Want to Hold Your Hand. On the screen, each of their names flashed while they sang. When John Lennon was suggested, the sign said, "Sorry girls, he's married." That instant did not amuse. It ignited Beatlemania throughout America and started what would become the British invasion. It forever altered pop culture. George was frequently overshadowed, however. He had penned his first song, Don't Bother Me, in 1963 after falling ill in a hotel. It wasn't a classic, but it established he could write. Nonetheless, John and Paul dominated almost every album. George was generally restricted to only 2 songs, regardless of how many he had in the can. Paul confessed in 2022 there had been an implicit rule. He and John had made a decision early on that they would play the tunes. George was relegated, used as a sideman. Even the public accepted it. Lennon was the clever one. Paul was the cute one. George was the quiet one. Ringo was the fortunate one. George's persona was squeezed into quietness when actually he had so much to say. By 1966, Indian music was discovered by George. He learned to play the sitar while on the set of Help, and studied afterwards with Ravi Shankar. His sitar riff on Norwegian would revolutionize music, bringing Indian instruments into Western pop. But Paul ridiculed his spiritual quest, rolling his eyes at meditation and joking about George's devotion to Hinduism. That was a deep cut. George wasn't experimenting. He was finding peace in a world that was treating him like an afterthought. He wrote songs like Within You, Without You, and recorded them alone, because the others didn't even bother showing up. When Sgt. Pepper was released, George felt sidelined once again. By 1969, things boiled over. At Twickenham Studios, Paul kept nitpicking George's guitar playing. George replied calmly, "I'll play what you want me to play, or play nothing." That was filmed and exposed years of bitterness. George quit shortly afterward. Later, he wrote Wah Wah, complaining the Beatles were like one huge headache. Days later, when he came back, it was on strict terms. Relocation to Apple Studios, ditching the idea of the live concert and giving his songs more room. But nothing altered. Paul's supremacy only intensified, and George's resentment hardened. Even when George finally gained acknowledgement with something, The first Harrison song to be put out as an A-side single, it came too late. Lennon acknowledged it was the best tune on Abbey Road, but George realized the years of denial had priced him heavily. His solo album, All Things Must Pass, demonstrated what he had been capable of all along. But the damage was irreversible. By the mid-70s, George freely admitted that Paul had destroyed his confidence as a guitarist. He wasn't merely frustrated. He was traumatized. And then there was Betrayal. George's marriage to Pattie Boyd collapsed after years of infidelity and indifference. His closest friend, Eric Clapton, became enamored with Pattie and composed Layla for her. She eventually left George and wedded Clapton. George himself had affairs too, like that with Ringo Starr's wife, Maureen. At a dinner, he even told Ringo directly, "I'm in love with your wife." The bandmates' marriages fell apart, and John Lennon described it as virtual incest. The peace-loving spiritual Beatle was living a life full of anger, jealousy, and contradictions. Despite his spiritual search, George indulged in cocaine, cigarettes, and material excess. He preached about letting go of ego while living in a 120-room mansion filled with luxury. His songs warned against materialism, but he was surrounded by it. His contradictions made him human, but also painfully hypocritical. Still, when he released All Things Must Pass, critics hailed it as a masterpiece, the war and peace of rock. He followed it with a concert for Bangladesh in 1971, the first major benefit concert in history, raising millions for charity. George showed he could move mountains when he was not in Paul's shadow, but the ill will between them never recovered. When George had attempted to play guitar lines during the recording of Hey Jude, Paul had instructed him to desist. During Maxwell's Silverhammer, George endured interminable takes of a song he loathed at Paul's insistence. Paul's perfectionism bordered on tyranny for George. Even years afterward, their relationship was still strained. By the time the Beatles were formally inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1988, Paul didn't even attend. George received the distinction with Ringo, but the silence spoke volumes. The wounds were indelible. George Harrison passed away on the 29th of November, 2001, at 58 years old. His last words were spoken through his wife Olivia and son Donnie. "Everything else can wait, but the search for God cannot wait." Despite all the betrayals, the feuds, the heartbreaks, George's quest for peace never wavered. He was the reserved Beatle, but behind the reserve was a tempest of hurt brought about mostly by Paul McCartney, the band member he never forgave. And although history recalls their songs as sweet harmony, the reality is that George Harrison bore the bruisings of the betrayal until the time of his death.